The grand ballroom of the Hotel Cortez was a cavern of suffocating opulence, a place where the air was thin with pretension and heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and moral decay. Crystal chandeliers, massive and ostentatious, hung from the ceiling like frozen explosions, casting a fractured, diamond-hard light over the guests below. To anyone else, this was the pinnacle of society, a gathering of the city's elite. But to Junho, it was merely another cage, albeit one gilded in 24-karat gold. At 31, Junho sat at the apex of an empire built on shadows and steel, a Korean crime syndicate that had long ago transitioned from back-alley brawls to boardroom takeovers. He stood near a towering ice sculpture, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, his tuxedo tailored so sharply it seemed to cut the air around him. His face was a mask of bored indifference, handsome in a way that was almost cruel, with high cheekbones and eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. He was surrounded, as always, by a phalanx of sycophants, men who laughed too loudly at jokes he hadn't made, and women who arched their backs and lowered their necklines in a desperate bid for his attention. They were vultures in silk, and he despised them with a quiet, simmering intensity that sat in the pit of his stomach like a stone. The noise of the gala was a dull roar, a cacophony of clinking glasses and meaningless chatter that grated on his nerves. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness that was all the more acute for being surrounded by hundreds of people. They didn't see him. They saw the power he wielded, the danger he represented, the favors he could grant. If he were to strip away the wealth and the fear, he wondered if any of them would even look him in the eye. He took a sip of the scotch, letting the burn distract him, his gaze drifting over the crowd with the predatory detachment of a wolf watching a herd of sheep. He was looking for something real, something authentic in this sea of plastic smiles and borrowed influence, but he found nothing. The boredom was becoming physical, a tightness in his chest that made him want to shatter his glass against the wall just to see a genuine reaction. It was then that the accident happened. A rotund banker, drunk on champagne and his own inflated sense of self-importance, stumbled near the center of the room. His arm flailed, striking a waiter's tray, and sent a cascade of red wine and shattered crystal crashing onto the pristine marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot, silencing the immediate vicinity and drawing the eyes of the room. The reaction was immediate and telling. The banker did not apologize. He merely sneered, wiping a speck of wine from his cuff, as if the waiter had assaulted him. The waiter, terrified, dropped to his knees, scraping at the shards with trembling hands. Guests recoiled, creating a wide circle around the mess, their faces twisted in expressions of distaste, not for the accident, but for the intrusion of imperfection into their curated evening. Junho watched, his lip curling slightly. This was their true nature, revulsion at anything messy, anything human. He expected the manager to rush over, to berate the waiter, to restore order with loud commands. Instead, a side door swung open, and the atmosphere in the room shifted imperceptibly. It wasn't a grand entrance. There was no fanfare, but something about the figure who emerged cut through the superficial tension of the room. It was a cleaner. She was African American, perhaps 25 years old, dressed in a utilitarian uniform of dark blue cotton with a crisp white apron tied around her waist. Her hair was pulled back in a practical, tight bun, revealing a face of striking, unadorned beauty that seemed entirely out of place amidst the heavily made-up socialites. She carried a mop and a yellow bucket, tools of labor that looked alien against the backdrop of silk gowns and tuxedos. She moved with a calm, deliberate grace, her eyes fixed on the task ahead, completely ignoring the hundreds of wealthy eyes that bore into her. There was no hesitation in her step, no shame in her posture. She walked through the parted crowd not with arrogance, but with a profound, self-contained dignity that made the guests seem suddenly small and petty. Junho felt a flicker of interest, a rare spark in the ashes of his boredom. In his world, people were either predators or prey, either puffing up their chests to intimidate or cowering in fear. She was doing neither. She did not look at the banker who had caused the mess, nor did she look at the glittering crowd judging her. She simply arrived at the spill, set down her bucket, and prepared to work. It was a mundane action, yet in the context of this high-stakes theater of ego, it felt like an act of rebellion. She was refusing to play their game. She was refusing to be intimidated by their wealth or ashamed of her station. Junho straightened, setting his glass down on a passing tray without looking. For the first time all evening, the Korean Mafia boss was actually looking at something. The silence that had fallen over the ballroom was heavy, filled with the unspoken judgment of the elite. To them, the woman on the floor was invisible, a piece of machinery meant to erase the ugliness so they could return to their illusions. But to Junho, she was the only thing in the room that was in high definition. He watched as Imani, though he did not yet know her name, knelt gracefully on the marble. She didn't just slap a mop over the mess. She used a cloth to carefully pick up the larger shards of glass, placing them into a separate container to ensure no one would be cut. Her hands were gloved, steady and efficient. The banker, perhaps feeling the need to reassert his dominance after his clumsy display, let out a loud, derisive huff. "About time," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "And make sure you get the spots on my shoes. Girl," the insult hung in the air, toxic and crude. Several guests tittered nervously, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Junho's eyes narrowed into slits. In his world, a comment like that would cost a man his tongue. He waited for the woman to react. He expected her to flinch, to apologize, to scurry and scrape and beg for forgiveness for a sin she hadn't committed. That was what people did when money spoke. But Imani did not flinch. She didn't even pause in her work. She continued to wipe the floor with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion, the swish of the cloth the only sound in the immediate circle. It was as if the banker didn't exist. It was as if his wealth, his suit, and his rudeness were less real to her than the red wine staining the white marble. This lack of acknowledgement was a more powerful rebuke than any scream could have been. It stripped the banker of his power. Ignored, he looked foolish, a child throwing a tantrum at a wall. Junho felt a strange sensation in his chest, respect. It was a foreign feeling, one he rarely directed at anyone outside his immediate circle of lieutenants, and certainly never at a civilian, let alone a cleaner at a gala. He found himself moving before he made the conscious decision to do so. The crowd, sensing his movement, parted instantly, fear rippling through them like a current. They knew who he was. They knew the violence that lay coiled beneath his bespoke suit. Junho walked with the lazy, dangerous confidence of a tiger entering a clearing, stopping just at the edge of the spill, his polished dress shoes inches from where Imani was working. The banker, seeing Junho approach, paled instantly, his earlier bravado evaporating. He assumed, perhaps, that the crime boss was coming to join in the mockery, or perhaps to punish the clumsy waiter. But Junho didn't look at the banker. He looked down at the top of the cleaner's head. He wanted her to look at him. He needed to see her eyes. He was accustomed to being the center of gravity, the sun around which all other planets orbited in fear or adoration. He stood there, looming, his presence a dark shadow over her work. Any other person would have looked up immediately, terrified by the proximity of such a dangerous man. But Imani continued to scrub a stubborn stain of wine from the grout. She rinsed her cloth in the bucket, the water turning a pale pink, and wrung it out with strong, capable hands. The sheer audacity of her focus was mesmerizing. She was treating the Korean Mafia boss with the same indifference she had shown the drunk banker. It wasn't disrespect, exactly. It was something far more unnerving. It was neutrality. To her, he was just another pair of shoes in the way of her job. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of tense silence, she stopped. She didn't look up at his face, but at his shoes. "Excuse me, sir," she said. Her voice was calm, melodic, low-pitched, and steady. It held no tremor of fear. "You're standing in the drying area. It will be slippery," she didn't say Mr. Park, she didn't say my lord or boss, she just said sir, the same generic honorific she might offer a bus driver. The crowd gasped softly. No one dismissed Junho. No one told him where to stand. The tension in the room ratcheted up to a breaking point. The banker looked as though he might faint from the second-hand anxiety. Junho stood frozen, his mind processing the interaction. She wasn't asking for his approval. She was asking for his compliance, so she could finish her minimum wage shift. "Do you know who I am?" Junho asked softly. His voice was a deep rumble, usually enough to send shivers down the spine of hardened criminals. He wasn't asking out of arrogance, though it sounded that way. He was asking out of genuine confusion. He needed to know if she was brave or simply ignorant. Imani finally looked up. Her eyes were a deep, luminous brown, framed by thick lashes. They were tired, yes, but they were clear. There was no recognition in them, no spark of terror. She looked at him not as a legend or a monster, but as a man in a tuxedo who is complicating her night. "No, sir," she replied simply, holding his gaze. "I just know you're standing on a wet floor, and I'd hate for you to ruin those shoes." The simplicity of her answer struck him like a physical blow. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a decade. She didn't care about his reputation. She cared about the practical reality of the moment. She was grounded in a truth that he had long ago lost touch with. A smirk, unbidden and sharp, tugged at the corner of Junho's mouth. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of disbelief. He stepped back, slowly, deliberately. "My apologies," he said. The words tasted strange on his tongue. He never apologized. The crowd was stunned into absolute silence. The banker's jaw practically hit the floor. Junho watched as she gave a small, polite nod, not a bow, just a nod, and returned to her mopping. She finished the job, stood up, placed the wet floor sign with precision, and picked up her bucket. She turned and walked away, back toward the service entrance, her posture just as upright as when she arrived. She didn't look back. She didn't wait for a tip. She didn't wait for permission. She just left. Junho remained standing there, staring at the empty space she had occupied. The gala resumed around him, the chatter swelling back up as the guests desperately tried to normalize what they had just witnessed. But Junho could no longer hear them. The scotch in his hand felt heavy and meaningless. The conversations around him seemed trivial, the laughter shrill and fake. That woman, with her bucket and her mop, had possessed more sovereignty in 5 minutes than these billionaires had possessed in their entire lives. She was not a slave to this world. She existed outside of it, untouched by its desperate need for validation. And for the first time in his life, Junho felt a pang of something he hadn't expected: jealousy. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he was trapped by his own image. She was a cleaner, yet she was free. The rest of the evening blurred into a gray haze for Junho. He went through the motions, nodding at the right times, shaking the hands that were thrust at him, but his mind was entirely elsewhere. He found himself constantly glancing toward the service doors, watching the staff come and go, hoping to catch another glimpse of the blue uniform and the white apron. He needed to understand what he had just seen. It was a puzzle, and Junho was a man who could not abide an unsolved riddle. Why hadn't she feared him? Was it possible she truly didn't know? Or was her moral compass so rigid, her internal world so fortified, that external threats simply didn't register? The thought fascinated him. It was a challenge. He had spent his life accumulating power to force the world to bend to his will, and here was a woman who stood upright simply because she refused to bend. By 11 o'clock, The suffocation of the ballroom became unbearable. He signaled to his second-in-command, a sharp-eyed man named Kenji, who had been watching his boss's distraction with growing concern. "We're leaving," Junho said, his voice clipped. Kenji nodded immediately, speaking into his earpiece to bring the car around. They moved toward the exit, the sea of guests parting once again. But instead of heading toward the main portico, where the valets were bringing around the limousines and sports cars, Junho veered sharply to the left, heading toward the hotel's rear exit. "Boss," Kenji asked, confused. "The car is out front. Bring it around back," Junho ordered, not breaking his stride. "I want to see the service exit." Kenji didn't argue. He knew better. He simply relayed the new instructions, his face impassive. Junho pushed through the heavy steel doors of the service exit and stepped out into the cool night air. The alleyway was a stark contrast to the ballroom. It smelled of damp concrete, exhaust fumes, and the faint, sour odor of garbage dumpsters. It was dimly lit by a flickering yellow security light. It was the underbelly of the luxury they had just left, the reality that supported the fantasy. And there she was. Imani was standing near a bicycle chained to a pipe. She had changed out of her uniform and was now wearing a simple, worn gray coat and jeans. She looked exhausted, rolling her shoulders as she unlocked the bike chain. She looked smaller out here, more vulnerable without the armor of her uniform, yet the set of her jaw remained the same. Junho stopped a few yards away, his tuxedo glowing starkly white in the gloom of the alley. He felt ridiculous suddenly, standing there in a $5,000 suit in a dirty alleyway, watching a woman unlock a rusted bicycle. But he couldn't turn back. He needed to bridge the gap. He cleared his throat. Imani froze, her hand on the bike lock. She turned slowly, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized him. But again, there was no panic, just a wary alertness. "You again," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "You left before I could thank you," Junho said, stepping closer. He reached into his inner pocket. The movement made her tense, her body shifting into a defensive stance, ready to run or fight. He realized with a jolt that she thought he might be reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a thick money clip instead, peeling off several crisp $100 bills. "For the trouble," he said, extending the cash toward her, "and for dealing with that idiot inside." Imani looked at the money. It was likely more than she made in a month. She looked at his hand, manicured and steady, holding the cash like it was nothing, like it was paper. Then she looked up at his face. Her expression hardened. It wasn't anger, but a profound disappointment. "I don't want her money," she said quietly.
Juno blinked.
"It's not charity," he pressed, a hint of irritation coloring his tone. He wasn't used to being refused. "It's a tip." "You did a good job, I did my job," she corrected him. "I get paid by the hotel. I don't take money for being treated like a human being. That should be free." She turned back to her bike, snapping the lock open. "And I certainly don't take hush money from men who think their wallet is a substitute for their character." Junho stood there, the cash still extended in the air, feeling more foolish than he ever had in his life. She had done it again. She had stripped him of his primary weapon, his wealth, and left him standing there with nothing but his own inadequacy. He lowered his hand slowly. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice rough. She straddled the bike, adjusting her bag. She hesitated, looking at him one last time. She seemed to be weighing whether he was worth the information. "Imani," she said finally. "My name is Imani." She pushed off the wall and pedaled away down the alley, the tires humming against the asphalt, disappearing into the shadows of the city. Junho watched her go until the darkness swallowed her whole. He was left alone in the alley, the smell of garbage in his nose and the stinging rebuke in his ears. He realized then that the chase had begun. Not a chase for a lover, but a chase for understanding. He had to know what made a woman like Imani unbreakable. For 3 days, Junho had sat in his penthouse office, a fortress of glass and steel that offered a panoramic view of the empire he controlled, yet his mind was miles away, stuck in a grimy alleyway with the scent of refuse and rain. The reports on his desk, smuggling routes, territory disputes, revenue streams, were ignored, gathering dust like unread tombstones. His lieutenant, Kenji, had placed a thin manila folder on the desk 2 days ago. It contained everything there was to know about Imani: her address in the crumbling district of Sector 4, her 3 jobs, her debt from a sick relative who had passed, and her clean criminal record. It was a dossier of a hard life lived with excruciating honesty. Junho hadn't opened it to exploit her. He had opened it because he couldn't understand her. He was a man who understood leverage, yet she seemed to have no handles to grab. He needed to see her context to understand the soil that could grow such a stubborn flower. He ordered his driver to take him to Sector 4. The transition from the city center to Imani's neighborhood was like descending through the circles of a concrete hell. The pristine, solar-powered streetlights of the rich districts gave way to flickering sodium bulbs that cast a sickly, jaundiced yellow glow over the cracked pavement. The air here tasted of rust and fried oil. Junho's armored sedan, a sleek black shark in a sea of rusted minivans and bicycles, drew eyes from every corner. Men in hoodies watched from shadows. Grandmothers watched from stoops. They smelled money, and they smelled the danger that always accompanied it. Junho ignored them. He watched through the tinted glass as the car rolled to a stop across from a 24-hour laundromat. The neon sign buzzed with an irritating hum, the letter L flickering intermittently. Inside, amidst the churning of machines and the smell of cheap detergent, was Imani. She was folding clothes, not her own, but for a service. It was her second shift of the day. She looked tired. The fluorescent lights of the laundromat were unforgiving, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the slight slump in her shoulders. Yet, her hands moved with that same rhythmic, meditative precision he had seen at the gala. Fold, smooth, stack. Fold, smooth, stack. There was a holiness to her fatigue, a purity in her exhaustion that Junho found maddeningly attractive. He stepped out of the car, waving off his bodyguards. He needed to do this alone. The street was damp from a recent rain, puddles reflecting the chaotic signage of the shops. He walked into the laundromat, the bell above the door chiming softly. The sound was swallowed by the drone of the dryers. Imani didn't look up immediately, assuming it was just another customer, but as the silence stretched and the heavy presence of the man filled the small space, she paused. She looked up, a blue shirt half folded in her hands. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with a weary recognition. She didn't drop the shirt. She finished the fold, placed it on the stack, and then met his gaze. "You're a long way from the palace," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the machines. "I wanted to see where you live," Junho admitted, standing near a row of washing machines that rattled violently during their spin cycle. He felt overdressed in his cashmere coat, an intruder from another planet. "I wanted to understand why someone would choose to struggle when they don't have to." He gestured vaguely to the peeling paint on the walls, the flickering lights, the sheer griminess of her reality. "I offered you a way out, or at least a way through, and you looked at me like I offered you poison." Imani picked up another shirt, shaking it out. "You didn't offer me a way out. You offered me a debt. And in my world, debts to men like you are paid with things more expensive than money." She looked him up and down, her gaze analyzing the cost of his clothes versus the cost of his soul. "I live here because I can sleep at night here. The walls might be thin, and the heat might not always work, but the air is clean. Can you say the same about your penthouse?" Her question hung in the humid air, heavy and suffocating. Junho looked at the spinning drum of a washing machine, watching the gray water swirl. He realized she wasn't just rejecting his money, she was rejecting his entire existence as invalid. She was telling the king that his kingdom was made of ash. The conversation in the laundromat had shifted something in Junho, but the universe has a way of testing resolve immediately after it is declared. As they stepped out of the laundromat, the reality of Sector 4 introduced itself. It was raining again, a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the streets. Imani locked the door behind her, hoisting a heavy bag of laundry over her shoulder. Junho moved to take it from her, an instinctive, gentlemanly gesture, but she shifted her weight, denying him even that small act of service. "I've got it," she said firmly. But before she could take a step, 3 figures detached themselves from the shadows of a nearby alley. They were young, edgy, and high on something synthetic. Their eyes were glassy, and their movements were twitchy. They weren't professional criminals like Junho's men. They were scavengers, desperate and dangerous in their unpredictability. "Nice coat," the leader sneered, stepping into the light. He held a butterfly knife, flipping it open and closed with a metallic click-clack that echoed in the quiet street. He wasn't looking at Imani. He was looking at Junho. The predator had become the prey, or so the boy thought. "You lost, rich boy. This is a toll road." Junho didn't flinch. His expression didn't even change. To him, these boys were insects. He had killed men who commanded armies. A street thug with a knife was a joke. A dark, cold lethargy settled over him, the precursor to violence. He calculated the moves instantly. Break the leader's wrist, throat punch the second, sweep the leg of the third. It would take less than 5 seconds. He took a step forward, his hands coming out of his pockets, his eyes turning into chips of black ice. The air temperature seemed to drop. The thugs sensed it too, a sudden realization that they had made a fatal error. "No." The word was sharp, like the crack of a whip. It didn't come from the thugs, and it didn't come from Junho. It came from Imani. She stepped between them, dropping her laundry bag with a heavy thud. She put her back to Junho, facing the knife-wielding boy directly. "Tyrone, put that stupid thing away," she said, her voice tired but commanding. She sounded like a disappointed mother, not a terrified victim. The boy, Tyrone, blinked, his drug-fueled confidence wavering. "He's got money, Imani. Look at him." You can what?" she interrupted, stepping closer to the knife, showing absolutely no fear. "You can go to jail? You can get killed? Because that's what happens if you touch him. You know who he is? He eats boys like you for breakfast," she pointed down the street. "Go home to your grandmother. Before I tell her you're out here trying to be a gangster."
Juno stood frozen.
He was ready to dismantle them, to paint the sidewalk with their blood to show her he could protect her. He wanted to display his power, but she had protected him. Or rather, she had diffused the situation with authority rather than violence. Tyrone looked at Imani, looked at the silent, terrifying figure of Junho behind her, and snapped the knife shut. "Whatever," he muttered, spitting on the ground before turning and signaling his friends to leave. They scrambled away into the darkness. Imani watched them go, then turned to face Junho. Her face was flushed with anger. "Don't you dare," she hissed, poking a finger into his chest. "Don't you dare think you were going to handle that." "I could have ended them in a heartbeat," Junho said, his voice low, his ego bruised by her interference. "I was protecting you. You were going to hurt them," she corrected. "And then what? You get back in your armored car and drive away, and I have to live here. I have to live with the blood you leave behind. That's the difference between us. You solve problems by destroying them. I solve problems by living with them." She picked up her bag, hoisting it back onto her shoulder. "If you want to be in my world, you don't get to bring your violence with you. We have enough of our own." She walked away, leaving him standing in the rain, his hands still ready for a fight that never happened, realizing that his greatest weapon was, in her eyes, his greatest flaw. Junho did not leave. He couldn't. The encounter had stripped away the last layer of his defense. He followed her, maintaining a respectful distance until she reached the rooftop of her tenement building. It was a flat expanse of tar and gravel, cluttered with drying racks and satellite dishes, but it offered a view of the city that rivaled his own penthouse, though from the bottom, looking up rather than the top looking down. She knew he was there. She didn't tell him to leave this time. She walked to the edge of the roof, leaning her elbows on the parapet, looking out at the glittering skyline that mocked the darkness of Sector 4. Junho joined her, standing a few feet away. He took off his expensive coat, feeling the chill of the wind bite through his silk shirt, but he needed to feel it. He needed to feel something real. "Why do you hate me?" he asked quietly. The question was vulnerable, a child asking why the dark is scary. He wasn't used to asking questions he didn't know the answer to. Imani sighed, the sound carried away by the wind. "I don't hate you," she said, and her voice was softer now. "I pity you," Junho stiffened. Pity was worse than hate. "You have the world in your pocket," she continued, "but you're starving. I saw it in your eyes at the gala. You were the loneliest man in that room. You think power is control, but power is just isolation. You build walls to keep people out, and then you wonder why you're cold." She turned her head to look at him, the city lights reflecting in her dark eyes. "I have nothing according to you. But when I walk down the street, people know my name. Tyrone listened to me because I helped his grandmother with her groceries. I have connection. You have fear. Which one of us is really poor?" Junho looked at his hands. They were strong, capable hands that had built an empire, strangled enemies, and signed million-dollar contracts. But she was right. They were empty. He had never held anything that didn't want to run away or didn't want to take something from him. "I don't know how to be anything else," he confessed, the words tearing out of his throat. "This is what I was made for." "The shark cannot apologize for its teeth, then stop swimming," Imani said simply. "You're a man, not a shark. You make choices every day. You chose to come here. You chose not to hit those boys. You're making choices right now." She turned fully toward him, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished. It wasn't a romantic tension in the traditional sense. There was no music swelling, no urge to kiss. It was a collision of souls. "You want to impress me?" she asked. "Don't buy the building. Don't beat up the bad guys. Just be human. Take off the mask." It must be so heavy. Junho felt a crack in the armor he had worn since he was a boy. He felt a tear, hot and humiliating, prick at the corner of his eye. He blinked it away furiously, but she saw it. She didn't mock him. She reached out, her hand rough from labor and cold from the air, and briefly touched the sleeve of his shirt. It was a gesture of profound mercy. "Go home, Junho," she whispered, using his name for the first time. "Go home and figure out who is under the suit." The universe, however, rarely allows for peaceful epiphanies in the lives of men like Junho. As he descended the stairs from the roof, his mind reeling from the intimacy of the conversation, the vibration of his phone shattered the moment. It was Kenji. "Boss, they found us. The Viper clan. They tracked the car. They're 3 minutes out. We're compromised." Junho's blood ran cold. The Viper clan was his primary rival, ruthless and indiscriminate. They wouldn't care about collateral damage. They wouldn't care about Imani. By coming here, by indulging his obsession, he had brought the war to her doorstep. He had done exactly what she feared. He was a contagion. He burst out of the stairwell into the lobby just as headlights swept across the glass front doors. Tires screeched. Men with submachine guns were spilling out of SUVs. Junho had his security detail, but they were outnumbered. He had to make a choice. He could hold the building, turn it into a fortress, and fight them off. It would be a glorious battle, the kind he usually relished. But bullets would fly through these thin walls. Imani was upstairs. Mrs. Ramirez was in 2B. Tyrone's grandmother was in 1A. If he fought here, they would die. The only way to save them was to draw the fire away, to leave, to run. It went against every instinct he had as a warlord. A boss never runs. A boss stands his ground. Kenji. Junho roared into his comms. Get the car moving. We're leading them out. Boss, that's suicide. Kenji shouted back. We have better cover here. I said move. Junho sprinted out the back exit, flanking the building to reach his car, firing his handgun into the air to draw attention. It worked. The Viper hit squad turned, seeing their primary target exposed. Bullets chewed up the pavement around his feet as he dove into the back of his sedan. Drive, he screamed. Get us to the highway, away from the residential zone. The driver floored it. As the car squealed away, Junho looked back through the rear window. He saw the muzzle flashes of the pursuing vehicles chasing him, moving away from Amani's building. He sat back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just surrendered territory. He had shown weakness. He had run away. And as he watched the lights of Sector 4 fade into the distance, he realized it was the bravest thing he had ever done. He had finally used his power to protect something by removing himself from it. 6 months later, the gala was held at the same hotel, under the same chandeliers, with the same hollow people drinking the same expensive champagne. But Junho was not there. His seat at the head table remained empty, a topic of whispered speculation among the elite. Rumors swirled that the Korean Mafia boss had gone soft, that he was restructuring, that he was losing his edge. They said he was spending his money on community centers and anonymous grants rather than guns and bribes. They said he was seen walking in parks without bodyguards. They said he was weak. But miles away, in the quiet, rain-slicked street of Sector 4, a black sedan parked across from the laundromat. It didn't stay long. The window rolled down just an inch. Junho sat in the back. He looked different. The tension that used to tighten his jaw was gone. He wore a simple jacket, not a tuxedo. He watched as Amani walked out of the laundromat, locking the door. She looked healthy. She had a new coat, warm and sturdy. She unlocked a new bicycle. Not a gift from him, but one she had bought herself, perhaps with a raise she had negotiated. She paused before getting on the bike, looking across the street at the black car. She couldn't see him through the tint, but she knew. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. She didn't wave. She didn't approach. She simply placed her hand over her heart for a brief second, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect between two sovereigns of different worlds. Then she pedaled away. Junho watched her go, a sense of peace settling over him that no amount of money had ever bought. He tapped the divider. Let's go, he told the driver. We have work to do. He wasn't a clean man, and he never would be completely. But he was learning that even a monster can choose not to bite. True change does not happen when we conquer the world, but when we conquer ourselves. Junho learned that dignity is quiet, and that the greatest display of power is sometimes the ability to walk away to protect what matters. We are all cleaners in our own lives, trying to wipe away the messes we've made, hoping to leave something bright behind. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of redemption and the strength of integrity, please subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to us. Like the video to help us fight the algorithm, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they are more than what they own. Until next time, keep your head up and your hands clean.